We're sold a version of God that makes us feel the best. God didn't. You hear so many stories about everything that God has done. God healed them, God saved them, God cured them. God did it. But every testimony is not a God did it testimony. And I wish that we saw more of the God didn't testimonies, or the testimonies where God said no. Because we see so many of the God did testimonies, it can make you feel like maybe you did something wrong when you get a no from God, or when God doesn't do it the way that you were hoping for, or praying for, or believing for. And something that I have noticed is that sometimes when people do get a God no, or sometimes when God doesn't do it, a lot of believers will tell them to just pray harder in faith. Pray in faith, keep praying. But the reality of the situation is that if it's not aligned with God's will for your life, it doesn't matter how many times that you pray about it. It's not going to happen. And a lot of people don't like to hear that. I didn't like to hear that. And then I know a lot of pastors don't like to preach that, because that's not the motive, like that's not the version of God that feels good. And a lot of us don't want the real version of God. A lot of us want the God that feels good, that comforts us, answers all the prayers, the God that is the superhero, the God that will bring down the walls. And that is God. Like, God is all those things, but he's also not. Sometimes you get the version of God that will walk through the hardest seasons of your life, the version of God that does not intervene, the version of God that does not heal them, the version of God that does not cure the illness, the version of God that does not answer the prayer. I think that there's this huge misconception that if you just pray in faith, it's going to happen. That all you have to do is pray and believe, and that is all that it takes for God to move. And that's not how that works. And it doesn't feel good to acknowledge that. Like, that's not like, that is not motivational. That's not encouraging. Like, that doesn't feel uplifting to know that you can pray and God's still not going to move. But like, that's the reality of the situation. And I wish that more people talked about what it felt like when God said no, or the moments in their life when God said no. But because nobody talks about these moments, we have a overflow of moments of where God showed up and God did the thing. So when you have a moment in your life where God doesn't do the thing, it can really leave you in a tough spot. What you see is God saying yes to all these people. I'm not saying is God has said no to them just as many times, because I wholeheartedly believe that everyone gets no's from God. Everyone's got a God said no moment. The issue that I felt like I was having was that because I never saw God said no moments, when I got my God no moment, I was heartbroken. I felt like God had forsaken me. I felt like I was the only person who was walking around getting prayers not answered. And I think that a lot of people will turn from God for this exact reason, because they see other people who have answered prayers. And then when their prayers aren't answered in the way that they hope them to be, or they don't expect them to be, it creates a wound. I like to watch, I don't like to watch, but sometimes I end up on like the deconstruction side of TikTok. And a lot of things that I have noticed about these people is that they are hurt. A lot of people turn from God because they feel hurt by God, or they feel disappointed in God. They feel like God didn't do something. But I feel like it's because we are sold this version of God that is the giver. Sold a version of God that makes us feel the best. A lot of times that is when God says yes, when God does the big miracle, when God brings that person back from the brink of death, when God protects us. God is so much bigger than that. God is also still God when he doesn't protect you, when he doesn't end the pain, when he doesn't keep you from suffering. We need more people talking about the no's that we get from God, because otherwise you're selling people a false dream. A lot of my disappointment with God came because I didn't know God. I didn't know the real God. I just knew the God that was preached on Sunday service. But as I started to read the Bible for myself, I was able to really start to learn the character of God. Paul asked God to remove the thorn from his side 3 times, and God said his grace is sufficient. And I feel like that's one of the most telling lines in the Bible, because Paul asked 3 times and God said no. He could have said yes, but it wasn't aligned with his will. Sometimes you will pray for things that you really, really want. You will pray for a breakthrough. You will pray for a miracle. You will pray for God to show up and show out. And sometimes he will say no. And that is not a reflection of your faith. That is not a reflection of your worth. That is not a reflection of being loved. But a lot of times people make faith in a relationship with God like a formula. Like, all right, you do this, 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 and this, and then it's got to work out. So when you do this, 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 and this, and then it don't work out, you are left to wonder what went wrong in this equation. For a lot of baby believers, or even a lot of seasoned believers, when you go through something and it doesn't work out how you would expect it to work out, and God doesn't show up in the way that you were hoping that he would show up, you wonder what went wrong. God, why didn't you move? God, why didn't you prevent this? Did I not fast long enough, God? Did I not pray hard enough, God? Was my faith weak? For me, it was going through the loss of my daughter, because when I tell you I prayed harder than I had ever prayed before, I was fasting, praying, talking to God, pleading, like I had probably, and you could not have told me that my daughter was not going to live. Like, I was proclaiming the blood of Jesus on her. Well, I was proclaiming the blood of Jesus over her life. And when I tell you, it was that moment when she was, those last 3 weeks of her life when she was in the hospital, like I probably had the strongest faith I've ever had. And it didn't change nothing. God didn't say yes to healing her on the side. And she passed away. So it was at that point where I really had to sit down for a second and try to figure out what had happened here, because I thought that I had done everything that I was supposed to do. I thought that I had done everything that I could possibly do to ask God to move on my behalf. And then when he didn't move, especially when it comes to when he didn't heal my child, when she took her last breath and went to heaven, it created a wound. It created a very big wound in me. And it was really hard for me to look at God, because the version of God that I thought that God was not the version that I had seen. Not to say that God didn't show his goodness and his grace after the fact, but like in that moment, God did not feel good. In that moment, I wondered why other people got the miracle and then I got heartache and I got pain. I got grief. But that moment, I feel like, is one of the most powerful parts of my testimony, is the God didn't. The God said no. And I talk about that because I know that I'm not the only person who got a painful no from God. But when you never see people talk about the no's that they got from God, it can make you feel like you are very alone. Like you're the only person that God didn't do it for. But that's not the case. There are a lot of us who have gotten no's from God, but we don't hear about people's no's from God because it doesn't feel good. Like, it doesn't feel like a testimony. Oh my God, like, oh, my daughter died. Like, how is that a testimony from God? I think that sometimes the testimony isn't what happened. It's the fact that you can go through something like that and still be standing. It's it's the fact that you can go through something painful and not let it break you. Like, I feel like that's really where God shows up and shows out. Sometimes God is not the rescuer. Sometimes God is the sustainer. So I think it's really important that we start hearing the God didn't moments, because when you get a God didn't moment, and you will, it's gonna be hard. And if you have based your relationship on the good feelings of God, the comfort of God, the moments where you feel held, if your faith is based on God's performance in your life, when you go through the valley, you're gonna be in for a rude awakening. I think about David a lot, because whew, David was God's chosen king, a man after God's own heart. But David went through some things. David went through some suffering, and I really enjoy the book of Psalms. The book of Psalms is gonna always be my favorite book in the Bible, because I feel like the book of Psalms is the most human book in the Bible. I feel like a lot of times in the Bible we get something. My biggest pet peeve with the Bible is that we get some sections of the Bible, like, we get such limited descriptions about what's going on. A lot of times we don't get understanding of what these people felt. And then if we do get an understanding, it's really vague. But Psalms, David talks so much about the pain and the suffering and the forsakenness, or the abandonment that he can feel at times. And it's heartbreaking, because it's heartbreaking at some times, but it's also very empowering in other times. Because something that I have noticed is that even when David is crying out to God, he always comes back to God. He's always crying out to God, to God. The moment that God says no is just as important as the moments where God says yes. And even though the God knows, the God didn't, testimonies don't get the million views or the 100,000 likes or the comments where people are glorifying God. If you got a God knows story, if you got a God didn't story, like that, there's somebody who needs that testimony. There is someone who is going to go through something, and God is not going to show up in the way that they are hoping for. And they need to know that God has not left them here. That he may not have been the hero in that moment, but he is going to be the sustainer in the next. Well, so thank you so much for sitting with me. I post videos 3 times a week. I'm aiming for Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but y'all, a girl be struggling. But we are doing our best, and I have been consistent for the last 2 weeks. So if you're grieving, I have a holiday grief guide that's linked below. It's on sale right now, and it's just a simple ebook that has journals, prayers, and it talks about 5 practical things that you can do to get through this holiday season. Thank you so much for sitting with me. Subscribe to my content so you never miss a video. Give me a like. If you are someone who has had a God did it testimony, I would love to hear it. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next week. Bye.